Welcome to the next video in the Understanding Crypto series by Thomas Plunkett. This video is another crypto law video. We're taking a look at the U.S. Treasury's recent virtual currency sanctions compliance guidance. Just a disclaimer, these slides were created by myself. These materials are not investment advice or legal advice. They're for educational purposes only, and the materials represent the viewpoint of the author and nobody else. All right, so the U.S. Treasury recently published guidance on virtual currency sanctions compliance a couple weeks ago. On October 15th, you can check out the website for their recent actions over here. Here's a link, and you can download the PDF of the virtual currency guidance from this particular URL. So let's go take a look at the materials online. My web browser here. All right, so here is the website for the U.S. Department of Treasury, where they have the sanctions compliance guidance located, and an updated frequently asked questions document. Here's a link to the sanctions compliance guidance. Here's a link to the press release related to it. Let's go take a look at the guidance brochure now. All right, so it's sanctions compliance guidance for the virtual currency industry. It's from the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Ofac. Here's a look at the contents. It's about a 20-page document, 22 pages. Just a little introduction, explains what Ofac is, talks about what Ofac sanctions are, and then it gets right into the really important part on page 5, where it says, how do you block a virtual currency? And it talks about a case study of Ofac sanctions involving virtual currency. And it talks about who has to comply with Ofac sanctions. Talks about strict liability regulations. It dives into Ofac reporting requirements, record keeping, talks about consequences of non-compliance, enforcement procedures, talks about some benefits if you voluntarily self-disclose, talks about compliance best practices. So, what should you do if you're worried about this? Management commitment, risk assessment, gives us a case study of diagnosing risky relationships, dives into what sort of internal controls you should have, and a case study of double duty data. All right, and I'll look about remediating the root cause of violations and risk indicators. And then there's a FAQ on virtual currency topics on page 20. So we're going to not go through the entire document because it's kind of long, 22 pages, but I'm going to take a quick look at some of the really important parts, like what are the Ofac sanctions, just making sure everyone's comfortable with what that is, talk about how you block a virtual currency, because that's important, and then take a look at some of these case studies. All right, so obviously virtual currencies are growing tremendously fast, and it brings greater exposures to sanction risks. Basically, the risk that a sanctioned person or a person in a jurisdiction subject to sanctions could be involved in a virtual currency transaction. So the virtual currency industry, which includes tech companies, exchangers, administrators, miners, wallet providers, and importantly, users, plays a role in preventing sanctioned persons from exploiting virtual currencies to evade sanctions and undermine U.S. foreign policy and national security. So these obligations apply to transactions involving both virtual currencies and fiat currencies. And so you, as a holder of virtual currency, are responsible for ensuring that you don't engage directly in a transaction prohibited by the sanctions, such as dealing with blocked persons or properties, or engage in a prohibited transactions. So here's just a little bit on what is Ofac. So again, Ofac sanctions are a lot of different sanction programs, each designed for specific threats and various policy goals. Each program may differ. It includes things like trade-based sanctions or embargoes, government and regime sanctions, list-based sanctions, and various sector sanctions. So there's a wide range of sanctions out there, and various blocked persons. So let's kind of scroll down. So how do you block a virtual currency? So once a U.S. person, determines that they hold virtual currency, that is required to be blocked. So once you know that you have a currency that's required to be blocked, you have to deny all parties access to that virtual currency. So ensure that you comply with Ofac regulations related to the holding and reporting of blocked assets, and implement controls that align with a risk-based approach. So you're not required to convert that blocked currency into a fiat currency. And you're not required to hold the blocked property in an interest-bearing account. You do have to report it to Ofac within 10 days and thereafter on an annual basis. And so if you determine that you hold it, you've got to do something. But until you determine that you hold it, you don't have to do something. All right. So, but then there could be a risk that you knew or should have known, and we'll talk about that later. So here's a case study of Ofac sanctions involving virtual currency. For example, in March 2020, Ofac sanctioned 2 Chinese nationals involved in a North Korea state-sponsored money laundering scheme. They received 100 million in virtual currency stolen from cyber intrusions against 2 exchanges and began layering the funds in complex transactions to include purchasing over 1 million in digital music gift cards. More recently, in September 21, almost a little over a month ago, Ofac designated a Russian virtual currency exchange for facilitating financial transactions for ransomware actors. Based on analysis of known transactions, over 40% of the exchange's transaction history was associated with listed actors, including the proceeds from at least 8 ransomware variants. So that's some of the use case studies. All U.S. persons have to comply with Ofac regulations, and strict liability penalties may be imposed. So Ofac can impose civil penalties based on strict liability. That means that in many cases, a U.S. person can be held civilly liable for sanctions, even without having knowledge or reason to know that they were engaging in such a violation. Now, as a general matter, they take into consideration totality of facts and circumstances to determine the appropriate response. So if you've got if you've implemented a risk-based Ofac compliance program, they're likely to take that into account as a good thing when they're doing enforcement. So they talk about reported requirements. We're going to skip through the license procedures, consequences of non-compliance. Again, if you discover there's been a violation and you do a voluntary self-disclosure, this can result in a 50% reduction in any penalty. So that's a good thing to report it if you do discover something. There's a variety of best practices about training, risk assessment, testing, auditing. I'm going to skip through that. But let's take a look at this risk assessment case study. So in 2021, Ofac entered into a settlement agreement with a U.S. virtual currency payment service provider for processing virtual currency transactions between the company's customers and persons located in sanctioned jurisdictions. While the company's sanctions compliance controls included screening its direct customers, whether they are merchants in the U.S. and elsewhere, company did not screen who was buying stuff from those merchants. So, and in fact, so the company knew that they were actually coming from these sanctioned jurisdictions. So you should have a risk assessment that includes understanding who is accessing your platform or services. So that's another case study of failing to do a proper risk assessment. And here's our third risk assessment dealing with internal controls. On double duty data, one sanctions risk that members of the virtual currency industry face is from users located in sanctioned jurisdictions who try to access virtual currency products and services. Again, what we were just talking about. Depending on the circumstances, this can result in a sanctions violation. So in 2020, a U.S. company that offered digital asset custody, trading, and financing services internationally entered into a settlement agreement with Ofac for processing virtual currency transactions on behalf of individuals who appeared to be located in sanctioned jurisdictions. Although the company tracked its users' IP addresses when users logged in for security purposes, the company did not use the IP address information to collect it to screen for and prevent potential sanctions violations. So it failed to prevent use of its non-custodial secure digital wallet management service by individuals with IP addresses located in Ukraine, Cuba, Iran, Sudan, and Syria, all sanctioned jurisdictions. So implementing internal controls to screen available data and block activity involving certain IP addresses can prevent sanctions violations. So a little bit more about best practices for monitoring transactions, preventing, screening to make sure that people on sanctions lists can't get in, having risk indicators or red flags, like various, like someone is providing inaccurate and incomplete KYC information, they're non-responsive to providing KYC information, and so on. Having testing and auditing is a good part, having training, and then we've got some facts, frequently asked questions, and there's several of them here. For Ofac sanctions, I'm not going to go through them, but we kind of went through this stuff. And we got contact information and resource sites for more information. So again, this is a short 22-page brochure on sanctions compliance guidance for the virtual currency industry, and hopefully helping people to stay out of trouble with the U.S. Treasury Department. So I'm going to switch back over to the slides. So again, thanks for watching this short little video on U.S. Treasury virtual currency sanctions compliance guidance, part of the Understanding Crypto series by Thomas Plunkett. If you have any comments, feel free to let me know what you thought about this video.